Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. Today I have Joanna Pinkerton with me. She is the current CEO of COTA, which stands for Central Ohio Transit Authority. She's held various leadership positions previously in technology institutions like Honda, The Ohio State University, Transportation Research Center, and among other positions. Thank you, Joanna, for joining me today. Tell me a little bit about your background and your journey to becoming CEO of COTA.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here with you. And that's a really broad question. It's been a long, winding
Yeah.
journey to this current moment in time. And I would say, in an effort to keep it short, my path here has just been an exciting lifetime of accepting opportunities when they come up. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a straight line. Life kind of takes you to different places, but if you're open to new concepts and ideas, you just never know where it will take you. And I've been here almost 6 years, but
Mm-hmm.
I can promise you that, as a, I don't know, 8 or 9 year old girl, I didn't wake up one day and say, I want to be a transit CEO. That was
Mm-hmm.
not something that was really in my life plan to the extent that we can have plans. So I've had a really great career, starting with my engineering background and engineering degree. That led me to some really exciting opportunities like being the CEO at COTA.
Yeah, certainly. I think most of us think we know what we want to be when we're 8 or 9, and then life just changes. And
Yeah.
I don't think anyone can look back and say, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Um,
No.
that sparks a question for me to kind of go back a little bit in time. Tell me about your first job that you had and what that job was and how that impacted you.
So technically my first job, I think like
Mm-hmm.
many teenagers, was babysitting, but I'm going to tell you about my
Mm-hmm.
first W-2 job. I was 14 and I worked for a doctor's office.
Mm-hmm.
So in the medical field, and my mother happened to work there, and they had a program where they brought high schoolers in, and you worked in this system, which, looking back, now keep in mind, this was the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So this is before Windows, before Microsoft, before computer use was a thing, and they had created their own system of digital records, digital medical records,
Mm-hmm.
and they had more than 20,000 patients. And working in that environment where they had literally developed this system of how to keep track of tens of thousands of patients, protect their medical records. We could look them up electronically. Everything was color
Mm-hmm.
coded. It was kind of for the engineers out there, it was like the
Yeah,
DOS-based version of
I
how you would
see.
track things.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, that had a huge impact. I don't think I understood it at the time,
Mm-hmm.
but looking back now, um, working in organizations that have very sophisticated systems, and sometimes those systems don't work very well, I look back 40 some years ago and think, wow, that's pretty impressive that
Mm-hmm.
the doctors, the medical professionals had enough respect for the business acumen to know that certain things had to be in place for their patients to have the best experience and the best medical care.
Mm, that's interesting. And that didn't spark an interest to go into the medical field for you?
Quite the opposite. My mother was a medical professional for 43 years, a registered nurse.
Wow.
Um, and no, oh gosh, being like a nurse or a doctor was
Mm-hmm.
never really something I was interested in. Now, the design side of it, right? Like how things work, how they function,
Right.
how they're connected, that part really resonated with me. I enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm. No, I can relate. My family wanted me to be a doctor, and I was like, okay, that sounds cool. But once I knew it, so like get to things like with the human body and like blood and all of that, I was just like eternally grossed out. But I think thinking about design and physics and like the details of problem solving, that just came
Hmm.
more naturally to me. So that why I ended up being an engineer. But I can relate.
I think I had some of those same attributes.
I know a lot of people struggle with this. So how do you determine your own worth when you're negotiating a salary?
Well, that's a really important question, and I'm not really sure who your
Hmm.
audience is, but I'm gonna take a guess, and I'm gonna
Yeah,
presume that there's a significant number of women who might be listening to this.
yeah.
Um, and I will admit very openly and publicly, I have not been good at
Hmm.
that. or was not
Mhm.
good at that the first couple decades of my career.
Mhm.
I was really raised in a work hard, work ethic is the most important thing type family,
Mhm.
um, and never understood things like um, pay gaps based on
Mhm.
gender or
Right.
race. And
Yeah.
so these are things that I've learned a little later in my career.
Mhm.
And now that I understand them better, I certainly am a better advocate, not just for myself,
Mhm.
but for others in making sure we have equity. But I wasn't good at it.
Right.
I still remember being an engineer, young engineer, mother
Mhm.
of two at the time, commuting and
Mhm.
finding out that someone who had the same job as me made 2.5 times what I made.
Mhm.
And that
Yeah.
was a really devastating
Mhm.
situation for me because I was working so hard to
Mhm.
try, my husband and I at the time, to really,
Mhm.
build our family and build
Yeah.
equity in a home and have this happy lifestyle. And
Mhm.
it it threw me for a loop. I
Yeah.
honestly did not know what to do.
Yeah.
Um, the very next job opportunity that I took after that, they offered me less money,
Mhm.
and I pushed back. And that was the first time ever that I pushed back and said,
Mhm.
I have this many years of experience. You've recruited me to this job for
Yeah.
this reason. And so that was kind of a little step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Even coming here into this role,
Mhm.
that was a tough conversation for me to have with the board of directors.
Mhm.
So I really started building allies within the
Mm.
community of, um, CEOs doing the same type of job should be paid equally, regardless of whether they're a
Mhm.
woman or maybe they came from automotive over to transit. Maybe they've been from different industries. So it's been something I've learned along the
Yeah.
way. And I would
Mhm.
say I'm better at empowering others to have that conversation than
Yeah.
really I have been.
Yeah. That's a fair statement. I think sometimes, at least for me, it comes easier to encourage people who are, my peers and in my community. And when it comes to myself, there is something that, stops me or like limit yourself in some way. Maybe it's like psychological, but it does happen. I have a couple of follow-up questions. So going back to your first experience of realizing that your pay with your colleague there was a huge parity. How did that how did you find out? What was the situation? Do you mind sharing the details?
Well, in that case, that person's supervisor actually told me how much that person
Mm-hmm.
was making. The conversation, maybe I'd
Mm-hmm.
asked.
Yeah.
So they were very transparent about it.
Mm-hmm.
It also was a public entity, so those type
Mm-hmm.
of things nowadays you can look them up on the internet pretty quickly.
Right.
You
Yeah.
couldn't do that back
Mm-hmm.
then. Um, and then it really changed my conversation with myself about how long I should stay in my role and
Mm-hmm.
whether I thought that was fair for me.
Mm-hmm.
Ended up having some really good conversations with my management.
Mm-hmm.
They did actually help me come up with a program where I could work from home 2 days a week,
Mm-hmm.
which was extremely helpful for me having two toddlers.
Yeah.
And that way I didn't have to commute 2 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the first person to do that within my organization.
I
And
see.
that probably doesn't sound that novel nowadays,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was a big deal 20 years
No,
ago. So
totally.
it empowered me to have more conversations, but it didn't fix itself. I didn't magically get
Mm-hmm.
my pay doubled.
So when you had to eventually leave that position to get a pay raise, they hadn't made an effort
I
to
did.
pay you more.
Yeah,
Okay.
they did not have the capacity, but also at the time I was commuting
Mm,
a really long way. So there were other factors of why I left that role so that I could have
I
more time
see.
to be at home
Yeah.
and handling my other job responsibilities.
Gotcha. What would you say are some things that, currently if someone is finding themselves in that position, what actions can they take to remedy the pay parity?
I would like to believe
Mm-hmm.
that there's a lack of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to look at intent. So, is
Yeah.
that being done deliberately or is
Mm-hmm.
it unintentional? Is it the product of systems which have just existed for years and years? So,
Right.
I'd say if you find yourself in that situation, as I have multiple times,
Mm-hmm.
bring it up and just have a
Yeah.
transparent conversation about it. I remember when I started here as CEO, still learning the organization,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very passionate about veterans and their service to our country. And I was just evaluating pay bands of positions. And I don't know who the people were. I couldn't
Mhm.
tell you their names, but I saw us hire a mechanic with some
Mhm.
years experience, let's say 10.
Yeah.
And then this other mechanic who came in who had less experience, but had been in the military for 8 years. And
Mhm.
they were going to make less money. And I remember asking my HR, why is this person going to make less
Mhm.
than this person?
Yeah.
And they said, well, they have less years experience. And I said, well, have we looked at their military experience? What did they do
Mhm.
in the
Right.
military? Did they work with heavy equipment? Did they repair things? So there was a system in place, and
Mhm.
it wasn't a bad system. It wasn't intended to hurt people,
Right.
but it was this lens that HR was using to say they only have this number of years of experience. So as engineers, we're taught to question everything.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
was like, well, let's take a look at that. And when they looked, it's like, oh, well, wow, the military service really adds this much value to this person.
Mhm.
Turns out that person actually has 12 years experience, not 8. So
Right.
um, I think opening the conversation and questioning everything usually starts you on a path to a better outcome. Now, you
Mhm.
also may find that there's some resistance to that.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, it may not be the right place for you. But
Right.
opening the conversation usually is the first step.
Both of those tips are, I think, really actionable and great to kind of keep in the back of your mind for those situations that might come up. And something similar, I had experienced this past year at my current position as well, where, I did have to advocate for myself for me to be able to get the next promotion. And that's something that I had found there was resistance and there were different perspectives on this is what our system is, but I also had to, find people who can advocate for me. And I think that can also be really helpful if you have a manager or a PM who can, speak to your merit. And sometimes being in an industry where, at least like for myself, being in the aerospace industry, and I'm sure maybe automotive is a little bit similar too, it is predominantly male. So it can be difficult sometimes to know how to speak up yourself or maybe feel a little left out. And I'm really curious to know about your experience as a female engineer, maybe if you can go back a little bit in time and, how that's impacted your path, if it has impacted you, and how you had dealt with that.
I'm glad you brought up the concept of allyship. That's not
Mm-hmm.
just for women. Now, I think
Yeah.
that maybe some systems are set up where just naturally
Mm-hmm.
it's easier for some people, but
Yeah.
it's important to have allies anywhere, like within your
Mm-hmm.
workspace,
Yeah.
within your personal life, because no person can be so isolated that they're not connected to other
Right.
people. So I think thinking about allies, not just from a pay differential, but just like a work experience,
Mm-hmm.
and what you can learn too. I
Yeah.
do think maybe my generation and older generations, we were immediately immersed into team concepts. How do you work with a team? How do you work with difficult
Mm-hmm.
people? How do you work through situations which maybe aren't ideal? And that's how you learn. You can be mentored. You can have peers and friends. Younger generations, because of maybe the intuitiveness that comes from the
Mm-hmm.
ease of having systems and technology available to you. There's a
Mm-hmm.
little more independent thought, and independent thought's great, but you have to
Mm-hmm.
learn how to apply it within a team
Right.
space. And that's where you really build those allies and where you learn from one another.
Mm-hmm.
So early career in engineering, I had some great mentors. I had people who taught
Mm-hmm.
me. I was willing to listen. I also
Mm-hmm.
had some work experiences with maybe strange people or people who weren't very kind. But
Mm-hmm.
every interaction with another person is an opportunity to learn. So instead
Yeah.
of just shutting down, I always kind of looked at the situation of like, what am I going to take away from this?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that having that curiosity and a
Yeah.
commitment to lifelong learning has been the most fun part of my engineering career.
I can definitely resonate with that. I think, even outside the workplace, there's always going to be different personalities that you're interacting with. And it is, a situation where as you experience life more, where you have to be maybe more open to understanding different perspectives, you have to ask questions. There's always the question of intent. And I think sometimes people can misunderstand certain things. And I think there's like an element of ego in there too. And I try not to, have that in place if I can help it, and just try to think from the other person's perspective of, maybe that's not what they intended to say, or, kind of over communicating a little bit and like asking questions. Well, is this actually what you wanted? Those sort of things I think can be helpful to kind of bridge the communication. And of course, there'll be people who are just impossible to work with. Like, it's okay to acknowledge that. But
Mhm.
for the most part, that's not the case, right? Yeah.
No, it's not. And I think as engineers too, we're classically trained to question
Mm-hmm.
everything, break it down, tear it apart, fix it, build it back
Mm-hmm.
better.
Yeah.
That can be, that process of scientific discovery and even just like critical thinking skills of like questioning everything and figuring out a better path forward. That can be
Mm-hmm.
intimidating to people sometimes. So um, it's really important, I think, in your career to make sure you're paying attention to your EQ as much as your
Mm-hmm.
IQ. Like that intelligence component and what you know
Mm-hmm.
is really important and really benefits you typically early in your career. But the longer you're at a place or the more you want to have more responsibility, you have to be thinking about that emotional intelligence. So
Right.
how do you layer that in with um, intellectual capacity? And I deal with this all the time where,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm saying something and I'm thinking a certain way, but I have to realize the person in the room or the audience I'm speaking with,
Mm-hmm.
maybe they don't have that experience or maybe they have a different
Mm-hmm.
experience. And how do I get them to see where it is I'd like to take them
Mm-hmm.
without, causing them to shut down just because I'm asking so many questions.
Yeah.
Again, back to being an engineer, I'll ask questions because I want to understand. Well,
Mm-hmm.
maybe the person I'm speaking with is a little threatened by all those questions. So you really
Yeah.
have to think about your audience.
I think that's a great perspective to add because sometimes you get so focused on your task of, hey, I have to do this, I have to ask these questions, and you're
Yeah,
so, like in tune with that, you kind of like forget the niceties or forget to like think about if that's a good time to go talk to this person, or maybe they're dealing
right.
with something else that takes precedence. But I think I'm
That's
sure
right.
as you became a leader and got into leadership positions, you had to kind of think about EQ a lot more.
Yes, you sure do.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, speaking of different positions and jobs, and you've definitely mentioned that, you've had to leave different positions for different reasons, and I'm sure there were growth opportunities associated with a lot of those moves. Even for myself, this I've only switched employers once, in the span of like 7 years of working, and
Okay.
that one switch over was quite a difficult move for me. There's a lot of questions of, if that's the right move or not. I am glad that I made the
Right.
move, but it was a hard decision to figure out. And I think
Mhm.
that can be something that is a barrier for a lot of people. So, how would you say it's the right time to quit a job or make a move?
So this might surprise you. I have
Mm-hmm.
never left a job and taken another job for
Mm-hmm.
career advancement. It's always been a decision that it was the right time for me or my family. Trusting your gut. There's no decision rubric, there's no matrix that's going to
Mm-hmm.
say this is the right time. And I know some people maybe have this imaginary ladder in their mind that they want
Yeah.
to climb, and
Mm-hmm.
um, they have this schedule and they think they should be making a certain amount of money by a certain
Mm-hmm.
time. But I have always believed that you will be where you are needed the most
Yeah.
and you will be in the right place at the right time. And when you start having some of that kind of inner tension or consternation, it's because it's like, wow, am I
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be here? If this is this what
Yeah.
is meant for me?
Mm-hmm.
And so the times I have left organizations, it was either I did not agree with the
Mm-hmm.
executive philosophy, like maybe I couldn't own that from an ethical or a moral standpoint, or
Mm-hmm.
I needed time for me to be um, more committed at home. Like I needed,
Mm-hmm.
your children are only young ones,
Yeah.
and I cannot believe that my two sons are as old as they are. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I think about how fun that was when they were younger.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked full
Yeah.
time the whole time they were young, but
Mm-hmm.
it whatever was going on in my life really influenced how I was able to show up at work and my
Right.
ability to do my job well. I take a lot of pride in my work. So it wasn't about career succession as much as it
Mm-hmm.
was feeling fulfilled with my work.
Hmm. I think that's an interesting thing to think about, and maybe something that maybe a lot of people might not realize until it's too late. So I'm actually glad that you brought that up. And another thing that kind of comes to mind is sometimes, as you mentioned, people might have goals of if I have to switch companies or switch this role because I want to make X amount of money, and this is going to help me progress in my career. But I actually think when you switch employers or make drastic changes, it sets you back a little bit because now there's a new team, there's a new company, there's new work that you have to learn, both as an engineer and both as building relationships. Versus when you are at the same company or same team, you have those existing relationships and you have that. People have like faith in you. Okay, this person can do this job well. We should give them a chance for take more responsibility with this project, whatever it is. Versus if you're new to the company, no one really knows you or no one knows you within the department. So it takes some time to kind of build all that up. So that can, potentially be a setback for some people, right? And you don't really recognize that if you're only looking at it through the lens of, the dollar amount.
Well, it's interesting, even your choice of word setback. I think it depends on your mindset,
Yeah.
right? So I have switched roles, I have switched
Mm-hmm.
organizations, and what you just described is real. Like you have
Mm-hmm.
to take time to get to know the team.
Yeah.
You have to understand the culture. And that might seem like a setback, or
Mm-hmm.
it could be viewed as an opportunity depending on what you bring to that
Mm-hmm.
situation. Like you were
Yeah.
there for a certain reason,
Mm-hmm.
they recruited you for a certain reason. And back to that lifelong learning,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to take time. It's okay,
Yeah.
okay to take time to meet people, to learn the
Mm-hmm.
new way, because you never know what capacity you bring from your previous experiences and how it might help that next organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's different ways to look at that. But it is a real phenomena that when you change
Mm-hmm.
organizations, you're going to have to adapt to that new culture. But I
Yeah.
think you just as easily could fall prey to
Mm-hmm.
status quo. You need to
Yeah.
challenge yourself. Even if you stay at the same organization for 30 years, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But you wouldn't want to be in the same exact role. You want to
Right.
work with different people, different divisions on different problem statements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because I have some employees who've worked here 25, 30, 35 years, and they always kind of
Yeah.
like to tease me that I'm a short timer. I've only been here 6 years.
Uh-huh.
And I mentioned to them that I've actually been in the workforce for 34 years,
Yeah.
just not at one place.
Mm-hmm.
And that really changes their perspective on my willingness to contribute what I do know in this space and in this environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I love that you pointed out like the terminology that I was using. And it is true, I was looking at it through a negative lens. And I liked what you said about time. And I don't know if it's just me and my own like impatience that's part of my personality, or if it's like a generational thing. But like I'm learning to be more patient and learning to like take the time, as you mentioned, to like build those relationships and be okay with, this is going to take a few years and, do all the things that I want to. That's something that I do struggle with because I think I do get impatient of like wanting to go to the next thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I will say I struggle with patience, and that definitely is part of that
Mm-hmm.
EQ side. You do learn that relationships are everything.
Mm-hmm.
Work can be inspiring. Work is
Yeah.
also a means to an end, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
paycheck involved.
Yeah.
And it depends on what your drivers are.
Mm-hmm.
I am really committed to having joyful moments in life. Well, you spend the majority of your life at work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
rather than thinking about things as just a deadline or an outcome, just enjoying the space that you're in. I think this is my seventh meeting today.
Mm-hmm.
That makes for a long day.
Yeah.
It's not always fun, but when I look
Mm-hmm.
around the room and I look at the faces, I think, okay, what is their takeaway from today going to be? And
Mm-hmm.
we always try and focus on the positive, like what is the outcome? My meeting previous to this, I'll tell you, was not a fun topic,
Yeah.
but it's like, okay, how did we get here? How can we throw this up on the board and have this quick work session? And what
Mm-hmm.
can we tackle leaving forward? And everybody left that room feeling better, even though we all
Yeah.
gathered because there was a problem.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, that's interesting. Do you feel like that's something that you try to drive as a leader in the room, that at the end of the meeting, we do want to have some sort of like positive action that the team can take and, not necessarily feel like, well, this was, awful, like we messed up or like whatever those emotions are?
Absolutely. Empathetic leadership
Mm-hmm.
is so important,
Yeah.
I think, especially nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, I'm still an engineer, right? So I want to know
Yeah.
the timeline, I want to know the
Yeah.
variables.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are so intently set on fixing things and things are so black and white, it's easy to lose
Yeah.
perspective of the fact that there's humans in that room.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
everyone there wants to feel better about something.
Mm-hmm.
So addressing what went wrong right away, having that, sometimes we call it a postmortem after a
Mhm.
project's over, or today, this is something that's midstream, it's going on right now. So,
Mhm.
do we need to make tough decisions to pause and pivot? But then saying, okay, what's it going to take? What do you need? What kind of help or
Right.
assistance do you need? Because having someone feel empowered, you're always going to get,
Mhm.
a better interaction with a person. You're going to have a better
Yeah.
product or service,
Mhm.
as opposed to maybe that old, I don't know, 1950s scream at them type mentality and send them, back to their offices. I think it's really important
Mhm.
to think about the people um, in everything. I think everything is a
Mhm.
human engineering problem, no matter what kind of
Yeah.
engineering problem it is.
Yeah, that's an interesting terminology, and I think it's something that we can all think about. And I do think the nature of work has changed so much, especially in the past few years. Now, I am happy to see that that is a factor that we're all trying to think about a little bit more and incorporate that more into the workplace. Because, as you said, we do spend most of our time there, and sometimes I think it's like easy to kind of forget that, but it does take up majority of your life if you are someone who's working full time. I know you mentioned a little bit about your journey as a leader. Was that something that you had intended to make the switch over from being a full time engineer to being a manager?
No.
Mm.
Although reflecting back, I think I had some
Mhm.
fantastic experiences even in
Mhm.
early years, like high school, college. If you are a problem solver,
Yeah.
you do tend to be put in positions of making recommendations, which
Mhm.
sometimes, ultimately lead to leadership. But I still remember early in my career as a young engineer,
Mhm.
a situation where a decision made
Mhm.
at a federal level and at the state house right across the street right there
Yeah.
impacted my project. And I just
Mhm.
could not wrap my head around how some random bureaucrat who doesn't know me, who doesn't
Mm.
know the people who were going to be impacted by that project could make that decision. And I was actually asked to go testify at the state house. And I was very
Mm.
nervous. I was very
Mhm.
young. I do not like public speaking, believe it or not. And I thought, wow, oh gosh, yeah. Public speaking is like a nightmare for me.
Mhm.
Um, and it is one of those things where you just have to learn that it's part of the job. And
Yeah.
in this instance, the engineer in me was like, well, I just want, to design it and build it and fix it.
Mhm.
But if all the decisions were being made upstream, I thought,
Mhm.
back to that human engineering, isn't that part of the problem statement?
Mhm. Yeah.
So I got myself prepared, did this testimony, and we still ended up failing. There was a lawsuit involved. So now I'm an engineer and I'm involved in a
Mhm.
lawsuit. It
Yeah.
just kept spiraling. But I learned so much from understanding that there are management structures in place which could impact the engineering downstream. So
Mhm.
that was a
Right.
real turning point in my career, understanding that you have to be involved in the entire system,
Mhm.
not just that one piece of the project that you're working on.
Yeah, a lot of people can resonate with that. I think most people don't really have like a plan in mind in terms of, where their future positions are going to be. Unless you go to like MBA school or something, then everyone around you wants to be a manager. But maybe my
Yeah.
perspective is skewed in that way. But how would you say, I know you mentioned public speaking. How have you improved those skills, which I'm sure is a important part of your job, at least currently?
It is a very big part of my job
Mm-hmm.
currently, to the extent that I don't prefer it because it's really about putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
And I think, especially as women, there are so
Mhm.
many expectations of us.
Mhm.
And a lot of that has to do with how you look, how you
Mhm.
sound, your
Mhm.
shape, your size, and all of these
Mm.
objectifiers. I feel like, and I don't know that I've ever said this publicly,
Mhm.
that really shaped a lot of my early years, like how
Mhm.
you dress, how you talk, how you walk.
Yeah.
And so it creates this fear
Mhm.
of really being vulnerable and being out
Yeah.
there in public. So when I kind of realized that that was a phenomenon that was going on with me,
Mhm.
I realized that that type of conditioning, like that was up to me whether I
Yeah.
allowed that to continue in my life or whether I said,
Mm.
okay, I'm going to have this feeling and then I'm going to get over it and I'm just going to be myself. Because that part I
Mhm.
don't have any trouble with. I am who I
Yeah.
am and I'm confident in who I am. But to do it in a public
Mm-hmm.
space is very different than to do it, in a private meeting
Yeah.
or in a friendship, in a conversation one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just something you have to acknowledge. And
Mm-hmm.
back to the root cause of like, what am I
Yeah.
trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
If that's required of me to have a conversation with someone, then I need to think of that as being just as important as the engineering formula.
I think that is actually really interesting to hear, and I appreciate you sharing that. And it kind of reminds me of like my own experiences of just being, I don't know, maybe like a little bit more quirky than most engineers or like loving fashion. And that's something that I've had to kind of allow myself to, be part of my personality, right? And not necessarily change that for the workplace. And I've, would have like gone back and forth at different points. And I think now I'm a lot more comfortable with just embracing that this is the whole, package. This is Lavanya, like this is what you get. But it is intimidating, not even including like the public speaking factor, just being, in the workplace and,
Yeah,
trying to like fulfill the expectations or maybe like false expectations of like this is what an engineer should look like or this is what an engineer should
that's
behave
right.
like and stuff. And maybe it's like psychological, but um, I would like to, see more people kind of breaking out of those. Um, like in the 80s movies or something, when they show an engineer and you have this like image, but that's like totally not true, as both of us know. But yeah,
I am sure you've seen Hidden Figures, right? Everyone
yes,
has, I
yes,
hope.
it's a great
But
movie.
right, an engineer was, a guy, maybe with a
Hmm.
cigarette hanging out of his mouth,
Yeah,
short sleeves,
yeah.
white shirt, little skinny tie, and
Hmm.
well beyond the issues of sexism, and then add
Hmm.
racism onto that. It's like
Yeah.
this person over here doesn't look like an engineer.
Hmm.
But think about all of the capacity that was
Hmm.
being lost by not tapping into that potential.
Yeah.
So even though those social norms are changing, and I do think they're getting better,
Hmm.
just what people think of when certain words are used, right? And what
Hmm.
they attribute that to. And we definitely, as young girls, go through a lot of conditioning from a very young
Hmm.
age of like um, what you're meant for, or
Hmm.
I don't even remember what store was it recently that
Hmm.
finally stopped segregating their toys by gender, which
Oh,
makes so much
interesting.
sense because,
Yeah.
yeah, why everybody plays with Legos. It's not a boy thing, it's not a girl thing,
Yeah.
it's a kid thing. It's even an
Mhm.
adult thing.
Mhm.
So, why would you condition people at a young age to say, I'm going to steer you this direction? So, the
Mhm.
same thing applies as you become an adult. You have to recognize um, what is it that you're dealing with that is because it was kind of taught to you as a social
Mm.
norm versus just being your authentic self.
Right, right. Definitely. That inspires me to ask this question. In situations where maybe you felt like someone was undervaluing you or like underestimating your
Mhm.
capabilities, how did you navigate that?
That's a really good question. One thing, and maybe this comes a little bit with maturity,
Mhm.
is you need to be motivated by intrinsic factors instead of
Mm.
extrinsic. Like,
Mhm.
do I love myself? Do I
Yeah.
trust myself?
Mhm.
Do I really need validation from that external person? So that's kind of one scenario of whether
Mhm.
you're valuing yourself. Another scenario is, do you respect that person?
Mhm.
And if you do not respect them, why on earth would you pursue trying to get
Mm.
validation from them? Another scenario I run into many times, you will
Mhm.
always work with people who, are not like you or might be difficult or maybe you don't agree with.
Mhm.
What can you agree on? And what are your
Mm.
motivators? So, can you mutually do things together, even if you don't agree, even if you don't see eye to eye, that lead both of you in the direction that you want to go? So, I think there's a lot to be said for accomplishing
Mhm.
things, especially when it's difficult, as
Yeah.
opposed to it was easy or it got done and now I get to take credit for it. I have worked on a lot of amazing projects over the years. You will not see my name on the
Mhm.
placard. I'm not there for the
Mm.
ribbon cutting,
Mhm.
but I know when I pass by it that I was part of something. So I think you really have to look at what drives you and what validates you.
What you said to think about, what is valuable to you, and maybe those are questions to ask yourself when you are in those situations. Um, I love that. I think that's really insightful. And it is like a very difficult question to answer, I would say, because there's just so many different elements of what someone could be dealing with when it comes to a situation where you are questioning yourself a little bit. I think I've definitely had at least one moment in my career where I kind of had to deal with a situation like that. And in this particular situation, this was when I had to kind of lean on. Um, like my allies a little bit to kind of maybe get validation from people that I trusted to kind of check, hey, this is what I noticed. Did you also think the same thing?
Yes.
Because I think sometimes I do feel like, am I overthinking something and like adding meaning to something that doesn't exist? Because I'm just so worried about like so many different things. But is
Yeah.
there actually like something there that I should be concerned about? So I think that's kind of like the first thing that I think about. And I think knowing what is valuable to you, I hadn't thought about that before. So that's actually great that you brought that up. Because people do things for different reasons, right? It's not always about, like you said, having your name on something. If anything, I think personally, that's something that I care the least about. I'd probably be like, no, like I'd be like more shy about it. I don't know if you feel that way in terms of taking credit. I know I struggle with taking credit. I want to know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I do a little bit. I'm a
Mhm.
builder and I like to see things
Mhm.
done.
Yeah.
Um, I don't really fit in very well in this world where people need
Mhm.
constant validation and gratification
Yeah.
from a like or a thumbs up or an outreach.
Mhm.
And science is even showing that that is so
Mhm.
short term and
Yeah.
dopamine based. I back to that work ethic, like I
Mhm.
take pride in knowing I made a difference.
Mhm. Right.
And what's the why? Like, why did we build that? We built it because it made lives better.
Yeah.
Or we built it because we did something that people said could never be done.
Right.
So I take a great amount of personal pride in knowing that I use my skill sets to help contribute to things being
Mhm.
done. Um,
Yeah.
History rarely remembers
Mhm.
any of us.
Right.
So that's really not, I don't think, the moniker or the measure of what
Mhm.
success is. It's like, what
Right.
kind of impact did I have?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Thinking about like a flicker of a moment in the span of the universe. So it really is like hard to think about it. What am I actually doing? What impact am I, having on things that I'm working on or the people in my life? And it is like a hard, like philosophical topic. And I think about this quite often of, you know, um, like why are we doing something even kind of like thinking about this podcast, even though it's like a social media thing, I'm someone who like really does not enjoy social media in general, which I probably shouldn't say that, but I like what you said about like are you doing it because of likes or are you doing it because you have a reason as to why you're doing it, right? As long as you have something that you think is valuable, I think staying true to that and having that be your North Star, I think is a lot more, I think just like holistically and psychologically better for you than worrying so much about what other people are thinking or are you getting X amount of likes. I think that's a great reminder because we all get sucked into the world of social media.
But I appreciate you sharing, even before you started recording, about when
Mm-hmm.
I asked you, why did you start this?
Yeah.
And, there was an intrinsic motivator for you somewhere in there
Mm-hmm.
where I like my
Yeah.
engineering. I still feel like I have creative capacity
Mm-hmm.
to expand and share. So, like, that is so much more fulfilling than I did it so I could see how many followers I got and how many likes I would get
Yeah.
today, because that is very
Yeah.
short term.
Totally.
So just staying true to yourself and following those intrinsic things that drive
Mm-hmm.
you is where I find the greatest success when taking credit. Taking
Mm-hmm.
credit doesn't mean your name's necessarily on it. Taking
Yeah.
credit means you know that you contributed.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of it. So, I know you have been in the world of technology and you have so much experience within the world of automotive industries and transportation. Is there a particular technology disruptor that you think will be that's something that we should watch out for? Or what do you think that technology disruptor is going to be, in your opinion?
That is a really deep question because, when you think of the pace of technology, and
Mm-hmm.
if you're a scientist or an engineer like me and you're following the progress of Moore's
Yeah.
law, there's even a debate about whether
Mm-hmm.
Moore's law is is
Yeah,
antiquated,
it's
and I
accurate.
think that's going
Yeah.
to no longer be accurate moving forward. There will always be technology, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's large language models, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
generative intelligence, there'll be new products, new services.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that will be the most disruptive in a positive or negative way is the accuracy of
Mm,
information
right.
sharing. So if we truly are a digital and information age and
Mm-hmm.
economy, um, and this was true 40 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
junk in, bad data
Uh-huh.
in, bad data out,
Yeah.
bad results.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest disruptor that's going to hit the technology sector, because the
Mm-hmm.
application of technology in every aspect of human life, I think, is pretty unavoidable at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more about the accuracy of it and the bias. I'll tell you, I follow and I've
Mm-hmm.
been trying to educate myself a lot about the development of technology and how it's applied and what type of bias might be rooted in to either the
Mm-hmm.
coding or the decisions that it's being made or even the product development. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the disruptor, is kind of the accuracy of the information.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'll have to be sure to watch out for that. And I think you're totally right because it's all about, you know, what you put in is what you get. And if you have bad data, you're going to have bad results. And I like that what you said is applicable to the impact that it might have on various industries. And that's totally true. Um, one question that I do want to ask before I let you go is, and I think everyone is going to want to know this, is what your advice is for women, particularly who are aspiring to be leaders in their respective industries.
So if it's an aspiration, I
Mm-hmm.
would say, first and foremost, allyship.
Yeah.
So find a mentor, find a trusted circle who can give
Mm-hmm.
you honest and open feedback,
Mm-hmm.
because a journey to leadership is not a linear path. It is not straight by
Yeah.
any means.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to also, I think, evaluate and look at your motivators. Are you
Mm-hmm.
seeking that for self-gratification, or is it because you want to contribute?
Right.
And
Right.
that results in two very different types of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So build a network, build some allies, because they're very few and far between when it comes to female leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And allies can be men too. I'm not saying it should be all women,
Yeah.
but then really look
Totally.
at what's motivating you to go down that path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I
Okay.
want the audience to get to know you a little bit better with a couple of fun questions. What's your, I think you already mentioned this, but what's your favorite tech or engineering related TV show or movie?
Well, would you believe it that I don't have TV in my house?
No. How did that
So I,
happen?
during the pandemic, I did
Uh-huh.
buy a TV and I started
Mm-hmm.
some streaming.
Yeah.
So that is like this guilty pleasure when I need to turn my brain off and
Uh-huh.
I totally decompress. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but like if I really need to sit down and just like watch something inspiring, back to Hidden
Yeah.
Figures, that comes to
Mm-hmm.
mind.
Yeah.
Um, I totally love the shows of like how things are built,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
the science shows. I subscribe to National Geographic and read that
Mm-hmm.
on my iPad.
Gotcha.
So I'm totally a geek. I subscribe to Tau Beta Pi's
Mm-hmm.
The Bent magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Read that kind of stuff whenever I get a chance.
I'm still thinking about how you didn't have a TV for a long time. I'm
Well,
gonna send you a list of my favorites.
I have teenage boys, and so we did have TVs, but the teenage boys like
Yeah,
commandeered them for their
yeah,
Xboxes, and I was
yeah,
just like, why should I buy another one? So
yeah.
just
That's
never really had
funny.
a lot of time for that, but I do
Yeah.
enjoy a pretty
Mm-hmm.
geeky nature show or science
Yeah,
show.
yeah. Love that. What about books? Is there a favorite?
Books, oh
Mm-hmm.
gosh, yeah, a lot of favorite books. I'm an avid
Mm-hmm.
reader. I'd say one of
Yeah.
my all-time favorite books ever is Out of
Mm-hmm.
Africa.
Okay.
Um, and I didn't even realize the story
Mm-hmm.
behind Out of Africa being written by a woman and her
Really?
having to pen the
Mm-hmm.
book under a man's name,
Wow.
because
Mm-hmm.
at the turn of the 1900s, a woman couldn't
Mm-hmm.
get published.
Right.
So that made that story all the more special.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I'm reading Nine Lies About Work, which
Mm,
is a good
okay.
read.
Okay.
Um, but I have a whole reading list. I try and build out
Mm-hmm.
52 books a year, try and read one a week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I've got a lot of good reads if you need me to send you a
Mm-hmm.
list.
Yeah, we'll make it an even exchange. I'm going to send you a list of movies that you have to watch, and you can send me
Okay.
a list of
Good
books.
deal. Good deal. Now, don't get me wrong. I love
Uh-huh.
the Fast and Furious series. I've seen
Yeah. Yeah.
all 10, but
Yeah,
those are
especially
ones I
with
go see in
boys.
the
I'm sure
theater.
you've seen so many action movies.
I love action movies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so this is an interesting question. I want to know if you could collaborate with a famous engineer, living or dead, who would they be?
There's some pretty amazing ones, but honestly,
Uh-huh.
like Mary Johnson comes to mind. I know
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people know about like Catherine Goebel and the whole
Yeah.
computing system at NASA. But the fact that Mary Johnson was like, I want to be an engineer, and it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter that I'm a woman, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't matter that I'm a Black woman living in the South, and I am going to
Mm-hmm.
go to school
Mm-hmm.
and go to court and get a court
Yeah.
order that says I'm allowed to attend a class. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is an engineer who was like, how do I solve the problem to be able to
Yeah.
work on the space capsule?
Mm-hmm.
Kathy Sullivan, who is
Mm-hmm.
a former NASA astronaut, is the
Mm-hmm.
only woman who's been in outer space and also to the ocean
Mm-hmm.
floor.
Wow.
So like think about that accomplishment. And
Yeah.
she's about 15, 20 years older than me,
Mm-hmm.
still doing amazing things. A
Yeah.
couple women like that. And, you know, she
Mm-hmm.
wasn't an engineer, but Marie
Mm-hmm.
Curie, like
Mm-hmm.
her work in chemistry,
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff just blows my mind.
Yeah.
And she did that without formal,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the same formal
Right.
education and
Right.
university systems that we have benefited from.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are all amazing answers. And thank you so much for sharing. Is there any parting wisdom that you want to share with me?
I will reiterate what I said earlier on, which
Mm-hmm.
is just be open to anything in life.
Yeah.
If you can have that capacity to be
Mm-hmm.
open, I think you will be amazed at where life will take you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. With that, I think today has been an incredible experience speaking with you about a lot of things that I know that you have amazing advice on, and I am just blown away by everything that you've shared today. So thank you so much for coming on my podcast and talking to me about these topics. And it's been completely enjoyable, and I'll be listening to this conversation over the years and looking back and listening to your advice. So thank you so much.
This was a lot of fun. I'm really glad you asked, and thank you for your
Hmm.
patience in working with my office. But I'm really looking forward to listening to this.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for making the time.